Okay, so imagine for a second that the economy doesn't just, slow down. Imagine it completely breaks. Well, that's pretty much exactly what happened in those really chaotic years between the two world wars. We're going to dive into a time when governments were staring at total collapse, and they basically had to throw out the old rulebook and start experimenting. And let me tell you, those experiments changed everything.
So what do you do when the global economy just breaks? I mean, it's a massive question, right? And leaders back then had to answer it with absolutely no safety net. When the very systems your whole society is built on suddenly collapse, what's the move? The answers they came up with, well, they ended up changing the world forever.
And that's really the heart of it. We're talking about a time when all the old established rules of economics just tossed right out the window. The entire world basically became this giant laboratory for some really desperate, super high-stakes experiments. And the outcomes, wow, they were nothing short of dramatic.
All right, so let's dive into our first case study, Germany's money nightmare. Our first stop is Germany, right after World War I. And the economic devastation there, it was almost unimaginable. And it was all triggered by one simple, catastrophic decision.
You can really see the vicious cycle here, and it's a devastatingly simple three-step process. First, you've got the Treaty of Versailles, which slaps Germany with these impossible war reparations. So, step two, what does the government do to pay them? They just start printing money, a massive amount of money. And the result? Step three, catastrophic hyperinflation. The German currency becomes completely and utterly worthless.
I mean, can you even wrap your head around that? Trillions of times. Trying to buy groceries with that kind of inflation, your entire life savings, everything you've ever worked for, just gone, worthless overnight. We're talking about people using literal wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a single loaf of bread. It's just a terrifying example of what happens when a government goes for a quick fix to an impossible financial problem.
And you have to remember, this wasn't just a German problem. Even back then, the global financial system was all connected. So when Germany defaulted, it set off this massive chain reaction. Suddenly, France and Great Britain couldn't pay back their war debts to the US. And at the exact same time, you've got the new Soviet Union just wiping the slate clean, saying, nope, we're not paying any of the old Tsarist debts. All this chaos just rippled outwards, and it ended up devastating colonial economies that were tied to their imperial rulers.
Okay, so from that inflationary nightmare in Germany, let's pivot to the Soviet Union. They were trying something completely different. They weren't trying to fix a broken system. They were trying to build a brand new one from scratch. And they were going to do it through a brutal top-down restructuring of their entire economy.
And you can see this massive shift in strategy right here. You had two leaders with two totally different plans. At first, there was Lenin's new economic policy, the NEP. And it was actually a pretty pragmatic move, It allowed for a little bit of free market activity just to get the economy stabilized. But then Stalin takes power, and all that pragmatism just goes right out the window. He becomes obsessed with one single goal, rapid, forced industrialization, no matter the cost. And his tools were the infamous 5-year plans.
So how was Stalin going to make this industrial dream a reality? Well, he needed to control the food supply and get workers into the cities. And his main tool for doing that was collectivization. What does that mean? It means the state seized millions of small, privately owned farms and forced all the farmers into these huge, state-controlled collective farms.
Just look at that number, 8 million. It's staggering. That's the estimated number of kulaks, basically the wealthier peasants who owned a bit of land, who were arrested because they resisted collectivization. They were branded as enemies of the state, and Stalin's response was just ruthless. We're talking executions, arrests, and being sent to horrific forced labor camps. The human cost was just astronomical. And the result of this whole policy was one of the worst man-made disasters in all of human history, the Holodomor, the terror famine in Ukraine. And here's the terrible irony. Ukraine was known as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, yet millions of its own people starved to death. And what's just absolutely horrifying is that while they were starving, the Soviet government was actively taking their grain, exporting it, and literally preventing people from leaving their villages to go find food. It's a truly chilling example of economic policy being used as a weapon.
So, at the same time the Soviet Union is creating this man-made famine, the rest of the world is about to get slammed by a totally different kind of disaster, the Great Depression. This wasn't just a downturn. It was like an economic plague, and it was so huge that it would challenge everything people thought they knew about how economies are supposed to work.
And you can see just how fast it all fell apart. First, you have the booming US economy in the 1920s, which was kind of helping everyone recover. But then, bam! 1929, the US stock market crashes, and it sends these shockwaves across the entire globe. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, it did. The US, in a totally misguided attempt to protect its own industries, passed something called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. It was like building a giant wall around the American economy. Of course, other countries immediately retaliated with their own tariffs, and pretty soon, global trade just froze. A crisis became a full-blown catastrophe.
And this right here, this is a huge turning point, because the sheer scale of the Great Depression just completely shattered that old traditional belief in laissez-faire, the idea that governments should just keep their hands off the economy and let the free market sort itself out. Well, it became painfully, blindingly obvious that the market was not fixing itself. Governments had to step in. They had no choice.
So, if the old hands-off approach failed, what did governments do instead? Well, they went down 3 radically different paths. Let's break it down. First up, you've got the New Deal in the USA. The goal was pretty straightforward: relief, recovery, and reform. And the tools were things like massive infrastructure projects and creating the first real social safety nets. Private property was still a thing, but it was now regulated. Okay, now look at a totally different approach: fascist corporatism in places like Italy and Germany. Their goal had nothing to do with relief. It was all about national unity and military expansion. Here, the state basically took control of everything, organizing industries into these state-controlled corporations. You could still own property, sure, but it had to serve the goals of the state. And then our third path, state-led development, which we saw a lot in Latin America. The main goal here was economic independence from foreign powers. They did this by nationalizing key industries, like oil, and passing new labor laws. So you end up with this mixed economy where the state owns the really important stuff. 3 very different answers to the exact same crisis.
All right, so we've seen hyperinflation, we've seen forced industrialization, we've seen a global depression. After walking through all that chaos, what are the big lessons here? What did we learn?
I think if there's one massive takeaway, it's this: huge crises force huge changes. There was no going back. Governments were forced to fundamentally rethink their entire role in the economy. And the responses were all over the map, right? From democratic reforms like the New Deal, all the way to the absolute brutal authoritarian control of Stalinism. It really proves there is no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to economic catastrophe. Every single path was driven by a different ideology, and every single one came with profound and often devastating human and political costs.
And that really leaves us with a big question to chew on. How do these historical examples help us understand the economic debates we're having right now? When we look back at these desperate experiments, the things that worked, and maybe more importantly, the things that failed spectacularly, what does that tell us about the role of government today? Every time we debate stimulus packages or trade policies or how much the state should intervene, we're basically walking in the footsteps of these very decisions. It really makes you think about the choices we're making today and what the consequences might be down the road.